A father drowns in a shallow pond, not by accident, but at the hands of his own son. Was it murder? Was it madness? Or was it something far more disturbing? This is a story that begins like so many others. A family, a home, the illusion of normalcy. But beneath the surface, something was tearing them apart. And on one summer night in 2021, everything shattered. What started as a desperate attempt to save a broken man ended in an act so chilling. Even police struggled to make sense of it. By the time the truth came out, the question wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was about whether evil had been hiding in plain sight all along. This is Vic's True Crime Stories, where the darkest tales aren't fiction. They're real. And this one will stay with you. There was a time when Scott Callahan was the kind of father people admired. The kind who never missed a school play, who taught his kids how to ride bikes, who worked long hours but always made home for dinner. His family was his world, his wife, his 3 children, the life they had built together. For years it was steady, it was safe, it was good. But then everything changed. It started with an accident. A traumatic brain injury, one of those moments that splits a life into before and after. At first, the changes were small. A forgotten name, a sudden outburst over something trivial. Then came the mood swings, the way Scott would snap at his kids for no reason, the nights he'd disappear without explanation. The man who once carried his children to bed now left them tiptoeing around his temper. And the worst part? He didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he just didn't care anymore. The drinking made it worse. What started as a way to numb the pain, the confusion, the anger, quickly became something darker. Scott wasn't just having a beer after work anymore. He was disappearing for days, coming home hollow-eyed and slurring, his hands shaking until he could get another drink. His wife begged him to stop. His kids watched helpless as the man they knew slipped further away. And Jack, young, angry, desperate Jack, saw it all. He watched his father's eyes go empty. He heard the insults, the threats, the way Scott's voice turned into something unfamiliar. This wasn't just a man struggling. This was someone else entirely. By the time Jack turned 19, his family was in pieces. His parents' marriage had collapsed. His father was a ghost of himself, unpredictable, volatile, a stranger in their home. And then Scott's mother died. The funeral was supposed to be a chance to grieve, to come together. But Scott, fresh out of rehab and barely holding on, didn't stay for the family dinner. He didn't say goodbye. He just left. And when Jack found him later, drunk in some dim-lit bar, swaying on his feet and laughing like none of it mattered, something inside him broke. No one could have predicted what Jack would do next. No one could have imagined the choice he would make, or how far he would go to end the nightmare. Because when Jack dragged his father out of that bar that night, he wasn't just trying to save him. He was preparing for something much, much worse. The day Scott Callahan walked out of rehab should have been a turning point. Just hours earlier, he'd stood at his mother's funeral, head bowed, surrounded by family who still hoped, still prayed. He might find his way back to them. But grief works in cruel ways. Instead of staying for the meal, instead of letting his family hold him up, Scott vanished. No explanation. No goodbye. Just the empty chair where his son should have been sitting. And the growing dread that this story wasn't going to have a happy ending. Jack was the one who went looking. 19 years old, still carrying the weight of a child that had cracked apart piece by piece. He tracked his father to a rundown bar on the outskirts of town. The kind of place where the lights are always too dim, where the air smells like stale beer and regret. And there was Scott, slumped over the counter, eyes glassy, words slurring. The argument that followed wasn't just anger. It was years of broken promises, of sleepless nights, of watching the man he'd idolized become someone he didn't recognize. Jack wasn't just talking to his father that night. He was talking to the ghost of the man he used to know. What happened next unfolded like a nightmare. Jack forced Scott into an Uber, his father's body limp with drink, his protests fading into incoherent mumbles. The driver asked where to go. Jack hesitated. His mother had made it clear Scott wasn't welcome home. There were no friends left to call. No shelter that would take him. And then Jack gave an address that didn't make sense. A pond. Just a quiet stretch of water. half hidden by trees, the kind of place kids skip stones in the daylight but avoid after dark. Later, Jack would say he just wanted his father to sober up, that the cold water would shock him back to his senses. But the truth was far more terrible. An hour passed. Then, too, when Jack finally stumbled back home, his clothes were soaked through. His breath came in ragged gasps. "I lost him," he kept saying. "He's gone." But the police didn't buy it. They found Scott's body floating face down in the pond, his lungs full of water, his skin pale under the moonlight. And when they pressed Jack, when the walls closed and the lies fell apart, he told them everything, the way Scott had fought him, the way his father's eyes had looked. Not human, not anymore. The name he kept screaming. Dirty Dan. Jack didn't just drown his father that night. He held him under, watching the bubbles rise, convinced he wasn't killing a man but casting out a demon. When the detectives pulled Scott's body from the water, they weren't just looking at a crime scene. They were staring into the heart of a family's ruin. And the question that followed them home, that kept them awake long after the case was closed, wasn't just about what Jack had done, but what had been done to Jack. Was this revenge? Was this madness? Or was this the tragic, inevitable end of a story that had been broken from the start? The courtroom smelled like wood polish and nervous sweat. Every eye was fixed on Jack Callahan as he sat at the defense table, looking more like a scared kid than a killer. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. A chance to answer the question that had haunted this case from the beginning. What really happened at that pond? But from the very first day, it was clear the jury would never hear the full story. The prosecution painted Jack as cold, calculating, a young man who'd finally snapped after years of abuse. They called it premeditated murder. They said he dragged his father to that isolated spot with one purpose in mind. But the defense told a different story. They brought in psychiatrists who spoke about dissociative states, about trauma so deep it could make a person lose touch with reality. They argued Jack wasn't in his right mind that night, that when he looked at his father, he didn't see Scott Callahan anymore. He saw something monstrous. Here's what the jury never heard, Jack's full confession. The way his voice had cracked when he described holding his father underwater. The way he'd whispered, "I had to kill Dirty Dan." Those words were kept out of court. Too prejudicial, the judge ruled. Without them, the trial became a battle of interpretations. Was Jack a murderer? Or was he just as much a victim as the man he drowned? For 8 days, the courtroom became a theater of grief and blame. Scott's family sat on one side, their faces tight with loss. The jury listened to experts debate whether a person could truly believe they were fighting a demon. They heard about Jack's childhood, about the nights he'd spent hiding from his father's rages. They saw the medical records showing Scott's brain injury, the way it had warped his personality. But none of it could answer the most important question. What goes through a man's mind when he kills his own father? When the verdict came in, it satisfied no one. Not guilty of murder. Guilty of involuntary manslaughter. 4 to 6 years in prison. A sentence that felt like a shrug after everything that had been lost. The prosecutors called it a failure of justice. The defense called it mercy. And Jack just sat there, his face blank, as if he wasn't quite sure who he was anymore. In the end, the trial left more questions than answers. Did Jack really believe in Dirty Dan? Or was that just a story he told himself to live with what he'd done? Was this a case of son pushed too far? Or something darker? A mind broken beyond repair? The truth died with Scott Callahan that night in the pond. All that remains is the echo of that final struggle, and the unshakable feeling that no verdict could ever make sense of it. Because some stories don't have endings. They just have aftermaths. The human mind can only bend so far before it breaks. Experts called it learned helplessness. That terrible moment when a person stops fighting back because they've learned it's pointless. They spoke about how prolonged abuse rewires the brain, how constant stress can make reality feel slippery. When Jack described seeing Dirty Dan that night by the pond, was it psychosis? Or was it the desperate invention of a mind trying to justify the unforgivable? The terrifying truth might be that Jack believed every word he said, that in those black waters, illuminated only by moonlight, he genuinely thought he was saving his father's soul rather than extinguishing his life. The Callahan family didn't attend the sentencing. There were no triumphant press conferences, no emotional statements about closure, just silence. The siblings scattered like broken glass, each carrying shards of the same tragedy, but unable to look at each other without seeing what they'd lost. Family photos became landmines. Holidays turned into minefields. Some wounds never fully heal. They just scab over, ready to bleed at the slightest touch. And what of Jack? Prison might have been a relief in some ways. 4 to 6 years was nothing compared to the life sentence of his own memories. He'd wake up gasping from dreams of that pond, the weight of his father's body in his arms, the way the water felt like silk as it closed over Scott's face. The other inmates left him alone, not out of fear, but because there's an unspoken rule among criminals. Patricide sits in a category all its own. Even behind bars, Jack was in a cage within a cage. This leaves us with the unbearable question that haunts every true crime story where victim and perpetrator share blood. When does a victim become a monster? Was Jack a tortured soul pushed beyond human limits? Or was there something darker in him all along, waiting for the right moment to surface? The terrifying answer might be both. Evil rarely announces itself with fanfare. More often, it whispers, it festers. It wears the face of someone you love until you can't tell where they end, and it begins. Perhaps the most chilling realization of all is this. There are no clean answers. No satisfying explanations. Just a dead father, a broken son, and the echo of a family that once was, before the injury, before the drinking, before the night when love and horror became indistinguishable in the dark water of that pond. Some stories don't end with a revelation. They don't wrap up neatly with answers that make sense of the madness. The tale of Scott and Jack Callahan leaves us standing in the dark, staring at questions that may never have answers. Was this a son pushed beyond his limits? A calculated act of vengeance? Or something far more disturbing? A young man so shattered by trauma that he could no longer tell reality from the demons in his mind. The evidence is all there. The years of abuse, the psychological scars, that final horrific night by the water's edge. This is why these stories haunt us. Not because they're mysteries to be solved, but because they force us to stare into the abyss of human suffering and ask ourselves the hardest question of all. What would I have done? Could anyone truly say how they'd react after years of watching someone they love become a stranger? Of being hurt by the hands that once held them safe? Now I want to hear from you. Look at all the pieces. The abuse, the brain injury, the alleged possession, the drowning. When you put it all together, what do you see? A victim pushed too far? A murderer hiding behind excuses? Or something more complicated? Something our legal system isn't equipped to define? The comments are open, and I genuinely want to know where you stand on this tragic, twisted case. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about it long after the final details were revealed, then you understand why we tell these difficult truths. The world isn't divided into heroes and villains. Sometimes the darkest stories happen in the gray spaces where pain meets desperation. If you want to explore more of these complex, heartbreaking cases with me, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There are always more stories waiting to be told, more questions demanding to be asked. This is Vic, signing off for now. Remember, the scariest stories aren't the ones about monsters under the bed. They're the ones that show us how thin the line can be between an ordinary person and unimaginable acts. Stay curious, stay compassionate, and I'll see you next time on Vic's True Crime Stories.